Hello Midnights. Up next, Amok, understanding a frenzied state of violence. Let us know where you are listening from and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you. The term Amok often conjures images of sudden, inexplicable outbursts of violence. While it has entered common parlance to describe chaotic or uncontrolled behavior, its origins lie in a specific cultural syndrome and a complex psychological reality. Understanding Amok requires delving into its historical context, clinical manifestations, and modern interpretations. The word Amok is derived from the Malay term Amok, meaning to make a furious and desperate charge. Historically, Amok was recognized as a culture-bound syndrome primarily observed in Malaysia and Indonesia, and other Southeast Asian cultures. It described a state where an individual, often after a period of brooding over a perceived slight or injustice, would enter a sudden, uncontrolled fury, leading to indiscriminate and violent attacks against people or objects. These episodes frequently ended in the individual's exhaustion, amnesia for the event, or even suicide. Early Western observers, such as British explorer Captain James Cook, documented these occurrences during his voyages in the late 18th century, contributing to the term's adoption into English. For centuries, it remained largely associated with these specific cultural contexts, often linked to concepts of honor, social humiliation, and traditional societal structures. To truly grasp the concept of Amok, it's essential to understand its place within the broader category of culture-bound syndromes. These are patterns of mental illness, distress, or symptoms that are considered unique to a specific cultural group or society, and which may not fit neatly into standardized psychiatric classifications like the DSM or ICD. Amok was, for a long time, considered the quintessential culture-bound syndrome, highlighting how mental health manifestations are profoundly shaped by cultural beliefs, social norms, and environmental factors. Other well-known examples include LADA, a hyper-startle response with imitative behavior common in Southeast Asia, Koro, an intense fear the genitals are retracting into the body, found in East and Southeast Asia, Susto, soul loss due to a frightening event, prevalent in Latin America, and Hikikomori, severe social withdrawal in Japan. This comparative framework illustrates that Amok is not an isolated curiosity but part of a broader spectrum of culturally influenced psychological presentations. The understanding of culture-bound syndromes has evolved. Many are now viewed as cultural expressions or variants of universal underlying psychological disorders, such as Koro as a panic disorder, or Amok as a severe dissociative or psychotic episode. This shift from purely culture-bound to cultural concepts of distress is crucial for a nuanced understanding. The historical understanding of Amok in Malay and other Southeast Asian cultures is also deeply intertwined with concepts of social honor and shame. These societies traditionally lean heavily towards collectivism, where group harmony, family reputation, and social standing are paramount, in contrast to individualistic cultures that emphasize personal achievement and self-reliance. In this context, losing face, public humiliation, perceived betrayal, unfulfilled obligations, or a profound insult, can be far more devastating. For an individual whose identity is deeply tied to their family and community's honor, such a loss could feel existentially unbearable, leading to intense internal conflict and despair. As cultural anthropologist Ruth Benedict famously noted in The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, contrasting shame and guilt cultures, in shame-based societies, the primary social sanction is a fear of public exposure and the withdrawal of approval. In societies with strong taboos against direct aggression or suicide, Amok could historically have served as a desperate, almost ritualistic, means for an individual to escape an intolerable situation. By committing a violent, often suicidal, act, the perpetrator might regain a distorted sense of power, restore in a twisted way their honor through a defiant, fearsome act, or simply find a dramatic exit from overwhelming shame, knowing they would likely be killed. This socio-cultural context helps explain why seemingly inexplicable violence could arise from specific social pressures. The way Western observers and medical professionals have understood and classified Amok has changed significantly over time. Early accounts from colonial perspectives, like Captain Cook's, often viewed Amok as an exotic, irrational, and barbaric act of primitive peoples, lacking deep cultural understanding and focusing on the spectacle of violence. This interpretation shifted over time. While Malay folklore attributed Amok to supernatural causes like the Hantu and evil tiger spirit, early Western attempts at physical explanations, for example, drug use like opium, parasites, or heat stroke, largely unsubstantiated, eventually gave way to its classification as a psychiatric condition around the mid-19th century. The inclusion of Amok in appendices of the DSM as a culture-bound syndrome reflected a growing awareness of cultural influences on psychopathology. the scientific study or manifestation of mental disorders. The subsequent shift in later DSM editions, like DSM-5's cultural concepts of distress, reflects a more nuanced understanding that while culturally shaped, similar psychological processes can occur universally. As Dr. Robert C. Cloninger, a prominent psychiatrist known for his work on personality and mental health, suggested in a broader context, understanding the human condition requires integrating biological, psychological, and social factors, a perspective that increasingly applies to phenomena like Amok. This historical trajectory illustrates the journey from anthropological curiosity to a recognized, albeit culturally influenced, psychopathological phenomenon. While once considered exclusive to certain cultures, modern psychology increasingly views Amok as a psychopathological behavior that can manifest globally, albeit with varying triggers and expressions. It's no longer seen as merely a cultural curiosity but as a severe psychological state. The hallmark of Amok is a rapid escalation into violent outbursts, often disproportionate to any immediate provocation, where individuals may engage in actions that are self-destructive or pose extreme danger to others, showing a temporary detachment from reality. Before the violent eruption, there is often a period of withdrawal, brooding, and internalizing distress, often stemming from perceived humiliation, injustice, or significant personal loss. Following the episode, individuals may have no recollection or only partial memory of their actions. The violent frenzy typically subsides, leaving the individual in a state of extreme exhaustion, often followed by a return to their previous mental state, sometimes with feelings of despair or regret. The phenomenon of Amok is a complex interplay of psychological, sociocultural, and potentially biological factors, and understanding its causes requires a holistic view. At the core of Amok, regardless of cultural setting, lies a deep-seated psychological distress that erupts in a sudden, violent manner. A consistent theme in both traditional and modern accounts of Amok is a period of intense brooding, withdrawal, and internalization of perceived grievances, humiliation, shame, or injustice. The individual often feels trapped, disrespected, or profoundly wronged, with no perceived outlet for their suffering, which can build up an unbearable psychological pressure cooker. Acute stress and trauma, such as the death of a loved one, financial ruin, severe bullying, relationship breakdowns, or social isolation, can also act as powerful triggers, leaving the individual feeling overwhelmed, hopeless, and unable to cope with their circumstances. Modern psychiatric understanding increasingly links Amok-like episodes to various diagnosable mental health conditions, often seeing it as a symptom or extreme manifestation of these disorders, rather than a standalone illness. Psychotic disorders, like schizophrenia, especially with paranoid delusions or command hallucinations, can lead to severe disorganization of thought and behavior, culminating in violent outbursts where the individual may be responding to internal voices or distorted perceptions of reality. Severe mood disorders, such as psychotic depression, where extreme sadness is accompanied by delusions or hallucinations, or severe bipolar disorder, during a manic phase, can lead to impulsive and aggressive behavior, as the individual might feel overwhelming despair, rage, or grandiosity that fuels their actions. Certain personality disorders, including antisocial, borderline, or paranoid personality disorders, can involve chronic anger, impulsivity, emotional dysregulation, and a tendency towards aggression, increasing the risk for violent outbursts under stress. Some theories also suggest that Amok can be a form of dissociative state, explaining the amnesia often reported, as actions are committed in an altered state of consciousness. A core component of Amok is the inability to control violent impulses, which can be a feature of several disorders where the individual acts without reflection or regard for consequences. As Dr. Jonathan Pincus, a neurologist who extensively studied violence and brain dysfunction, argued in Base Instincts, What Makes Killers Kill? Violence is ultimately about brain function. It's a behavioral symptom, not a disease, that is most often found in people with histories of brain injury or mental illness. He further posited that violent criminal behavior is the catastrophic product of a dysfunctional brain coupled with an abusive environment. While less definitively understood than psychological and sociocultural factors, there is growing interest in how biological predispositions might contribute to the development of violent behaviors, including Amok. This takes us into the complex neurological state underlying such extreme outbursts. At the neural level, Amok-like aggression often involves a dysregulation between bottom-up emotional impulses and top-down cognitive control. Key brain regions implicated in impulsive aggression include the amygdala, the brain's fear and emotion processing center, which can become hyperactive in response to perceived threats or frustration. This hyperactivity can drive intense feelings of rage. The hypothalamus and periaqueductal gray, lower brain structures involved in the acute threat response, are also central to the initiation of aggressive acts. Activation in the circuit can lead to sudden, unplanned, enraged attacks. These subcortical areas form a primitive rage circuit that, when unchecked, can override higher-level reasoning. Conversely, the brakes on these impulsive drives are typically located in the prefrontal cortex, particularly the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and the anterior cingulate cortex. These frontal lobe regions are critical for executive functions, impulse control, decision-making, emotion regulation, and understanding social consequences. In individuals prone to Amok-like behavior, there is often evidence of structural or functional deficits in these prefrontal areas, meaning they may not effectively modulate or inhibit aggressive impulses generated by subcortical regions. This imbalance can lead to a reduced capacity to assess risks, anticipate negative outcomes, or suppress overwhelming emotions, allowing the emotional volume to be cranked up out of all proportion. For instance, neuroimaging studies of individuals with impulsive aggression have revealed reduced gray matter volume or altered connectivity in the VMPFC, a region crucial for integrating emotion with decision-making and inhibiting inappropriate social behavior. As Dr. Robert Sapolsky, a renowned neuroendocrinologist and primatologist, states in Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst, the most important theme is the amygdala's dual role in both aggression and facets of fear and anxiety. Fear and aggression are not inevitably intertwined. Not all fear causes aggression, and not all aggression is rooted in fear. He further explains, regarding the prefrontal cortex, that stress effects on frontal function also make us perseverative, in a rut, set in our ways, running on automatic, being habitual. This is precisely where the frontal cortex makes you do the harder but more correct thing, recognize that it's time for a change. Except for a stressed frontal cortex. This vividly illustrates the neural battle in states of extreme distress. Neurotransmitters also play a significant role. Serotonin, an inhibitory neurotransmitter, is widely studied in relation to aggression. Lowered serotonin levels or dysfunction in serotonin pathways, particularly those originating from the raphe nuclei and projecting to the PFC and limbic system, are consistently linked to increased impulsivity, aggression, and a reduced capacity for emotional regulation. This deficit can manifest as an inability to put the brakes on escalating anger. Dopamine, involved in reward, motivation, and motor control, can have complex effects, sometimes enhancing aggression, for example, through hyperactivity in the mesolimbic pathway, contributing to impulsive reward-seeking or rage, or, paradoxically, reducing the impulsivity that might lead to abnormal aggression depending on the specific receptors and brain regions involved. Gamma-aminobutyric acid, the main inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain, also plays a crucial role in reducing neuronal excitability. Dysfunctions in GABAergic systems can lead to increased anxiety, irritability, and aggression. Neuropeptides like vasopressin and oxytocin are also implicated in modulating social and aggressive behaviors, with imbalances potentially contributing to altered social perception and increased aggression. Dysregulation in these complex neurotransmitter systems can contribute to an inability to inhibit extreme rage, creating a neurochemical environment conducive to an Amok-like state. Furthermore, some theories suggest that Amok can involve a dissociative state, characterized by a profound disconnection between thoughts, memories, feelings, actions, or sense of self. Brain imaging studies of dissociation show dysregulation in interconnected regions responsible for emotions, memory, and self-awareness, including decreased activity in the prefrontal cortex leading to emotional numbness or a sense of unreality, fluctuating activity in the amygdala either hyperactive during flashbacks or underactive in depersonalization, and hippocampal malfunction causing fragmented memories or a lack of coherent narrative for the event. This neural shutdown can create a temporary detachment from reality, allowing extreme acts to occur with subsequent amnesia, as the brain fails to coherently encode the traumatic or highly emotional event. Underlying conditions like traumatic brain injuries, especially to the frontal or temporal lobes, certain forms of epilepsy, particularly temporal lobe epilepsy, which can cause sudden behavioral changes, rage, or automatisms, or genetic predispositions that affect brain development or function in these crucial regions can increase vulnerability. Substance abuse, by acutely altering brain chemistry and severely impairing judgment and inhibitory control, can also directly trigger or exacerbate these neurological dysregulations, contributing to violent outbursts, even in individuals without pre-existing conditions. It's crucial to understand that no single factor typically causes Amok. Instead, it's often a tragic culmination of multiple interacting vulnerabilities and stressors. A person might have a biological predisposition to a mental illness, experience significant psychological distress due to social humiliation, and then be triggered into an Amok state by an acute stressor, especially if societal safety nets and mental health support are lacking. The way people from different cultures or backgrounds view the topic of Amok and modern mass violence is incredibly diverse and deeply shaped by their own societal norms, historical experiences, spiritual beliefs, and healthcare systems. For traditional Southeast Asian cultures, for example, Malay, Indonesian, Moro in the Philippines, Amok is not just a descriptive term for violence but a specific culture-bound syndrome with rich historical and sometimes spiritual explanations. Historically, some might attribute Amok to supernatural forces, like the Hantu Belian, an evil tiger spirit entering a person. This can shift the perceived blame from the individual to external forces, sometimes leading to less personal condemnation of the perpetrator's family. The concept is deeply intertwined with honor and losing face. Amok could be seen as a desperate, final act for someone who has experienced profound humiliation, a way to regain a distorted sense of honor, or to find a dramatic, often suicidal, exit from unbearable shame. While terrifying, traditional communities might react with a blend of fear, sadness, and perhaps a degree of fatalism or understanding, given the perceived spiritual or overwhelming psychological forces at play. There might be less emphasis on individual pathology and more on societal pressures or spiritual imbalances. They might recognize behavioral similarities with modern mass violence, sudden, frenzied attacks, but would emphasize the distinct underlying cultural motivations and context, potentially finding the Western focus solely on mental illness or individual pathology too narrow. Western societies, for example, the USA, Germany, UK, heavily influenced by the biomedical model, tend to frame Amok-like incidents as primarily resulting from individual mental illness, psychosis, severe depression, personality disorders, often seeking a diagnostic label. There's a strong emphasis on the broken brain or psychological dysfunction, and thus, solutions are often seen as improved access to mental health care, early intervention, and destigmatization of mental illness. The gun control debate varies significantly. In the USA, while mental health is frequently cited as a factor, the debate quickly shifts to gun rights versus gun control. Many Americans, especially those valuing individual liberties and the Second Amendment, will emphasize mental health issues and background checks as the primary solutions, resisting stricter gun laws. The idea of good guys with guns preventing bad guys, including those running Amok, is a common narrative. They might view incidents like the Washington, D.C. truck incident as isolated acts of disturbed individuals or even terrorism, rather than part of a broader pattern of Amok. In Germany/Europe, where the current location Berlin is situated, much stricter gun laws mean the conversation around Amok-like violence quickly turns to how an individual obtained a weapon, emphasizing stricter regulations, psychological evaluations, as seen in Germany, and robust security measures. There's less emphasis on an individual's right to bear arms and more on collective safety. While individual pathology is a strong focus, there's also an increasing awareness of social factors like bullying, social isolation, perceived grievances, and the role of online radicalization, which can be seen as a modern form of brooding. Western media tends to sensationalize such events, often focusing on the perpetrator's backstory, sometimes unintentionally contributing to a fame motive, and the immediate tragic consequences. There's also a strong public push for prevention of copycat phenomena. Many indigenous cultures and non-Western collectivist societies beyond Southeast Asia have a more holistic view of health, where physical, mental, spiritual, and community well-being are interconnected. Distress or violent outbursts might be seen as an imbalance, not just within the individual but within their family, community, or relationship with the natural/spiritual world. They might attribute such behavior to spiritual possession, ancestral curses, communal disharmony, or a breakdown in traditional social structures. Solutions often involve traditional healers, community rituals, restorative justice, and strengthening social bonds, rather than solely relying on Western psychiatric interventions. While Western mental health stigma exists, some non-Western cultures might have different forms of stigma. For instance, shame might prevent individuals from admitting distress, or a family might hide mental health issues to protect their reputation. However, in some traditional contexts, a community might be more accepting of a possessed individual than a mentally ill one. In cultures experiencing high levels of poverty, political instability, war, or systemic oppression, Amok-like incidents might be viewed less as isolated psychological phenomena and more as extreme manifestations of broader societal trauma, desperation, or resistance. Violence might be seen as a symptom of collective trauma. historical grievances, or the breakdown of social order, rather than solely individual pathology. What might be considered a frenzy in one context could be interpreted as a desperate act of survival or rebellion in another. Academic and professional communities in cross-cultural psychiatry and anthropology actively work to bridge the gap between culture-bound syndromes and universal psychopathology. They advocate for cultural competence in diagnosis and treatment, recognizing that symptoms might manifest differently across cultures and that local idioms of distress are crucial for understanding. They promote a comprehensive model that considers biological, psychological, social, and spiritual factors in understanding mental health and violence, moving beyond a singular explanation. They are critical of Western tendencies to impose their diagnostic categories and treatment models without understanding local contexts and belief systems. In conclusion, while the outward behavior of a sudden, frenzied, and indiscriminate violent attack might appear similar across cultures, the interpretation, meaning, perceived causes, and appropriate responses to such events can vary dramatically. These differences highlight the profound impact of cultural lenses on how we understand human behavior, particularly at its most extreme. The ongoing debate about mental illness, gun laws, and societal factors in the USA, for example, is a clear illustration of culturally specific interpretations of these Amok-like events. The concept of Amok has evolved to encompass various forms of sudden, unprovoked mass violence seen in contemporary societies, particularly in incidents like school shootings and workplace rampages. While not always identical to the traditional Malay understanding, these events often share characteristics such as an individual perpetrator, often alone, a period of premeditation or brooding and internalizing grievances, sometimes expressing suicidal or homicidal thoughts beforehand, and indiscriminate or targeted violence where attacks can be random or directed at specific groups or individuals perceived as responsible for their distress. Triggers are varied, but often involve a perceived lack of respect, bullying, social isolation, or a sense of being wronged. Modern research highlights the multi-causal nature of such events, emphasizing the interplay of individual psychological vulnerabilities, social factors, access to weapons, and exposure to violent media. While the term Amok originated in specific cultural contexts, the pattern of sudden, frenzied violence driven by deep-seated distress has manifested across various cultures and time periods. Historical examples include the Rajput Amok in India during the 17th–18th centuries, where Rajput warriors, facing extreme dishonor or defeat, would enter a suicidal frenzy, attacking enemies indiscriminately until killed. One notable case from 1634 involved the eldest son of the Raja of Jodhpur, who ran amok at the court of Shah Jahan, killing 5 officials before being subdued, demonstrating a similar underlying psychology of desperation and a desire for a glorious or defiant end. Numerous reports from Dutch, British, and Portuguese colonial officials in Southeast Asia detail Javanese and Malay incidents during the 18th–19th centuries, where individuals, often men, after suffering personal setbacks, gambling losses, marital disputes, social slights, would seize weapons and launch into a violent spree. These were often seen as a form of suicide by cop or a desperate attempt to regain lost honor through a final, dramatic act. For instance, in 1846, in Penang, Malaysia, a man who had suddenly lost his wife and only child killed 3 villagers and wounded 10, an act widely attributed to his profound mental disturbance after bereavement, fulfilling the classic presentation of Amok. Among the Moro people of Mindanao, particularly in the Sulu archipelago, the term juramentado emerged during the 19th–early 20th centuries to describe a religiously motivated, ritualized form of suicidal attack. While distinct from secular Amok, it shared the characteristic of a man preparing himself through rituals, shaving his body, and then engaging in a frenzied, often suicidal, attack on Christian targets. This was driven by a complex interplay of religious conviction, resistance to colonial rule, and societal pressures related to honor and martyrdom. In the modern context, while not always explicitly called Amok, many mass violence incidents share the psychological trajectory of brooding, escalating distress, and a final violent outburst, often involving firearms, leading to higher casualty counts. Research consistently shows that the vast majority of individuals with mental illness are not violent. In fact, some studies indicate that only 3% to 5% of violent acts can be attributed solely to persons with severe mental illness. This directly challenges common misconceptions. Conversely, individuals with severe mental illness are 10 times more likely to be victims of violent crime than the general population, highlighting their vulnerability. However, for individuals with mental illness, substance abuse often doubles the risk of violence, emphasizing a crucial comorbidity. For example, in a study of patients with bipolar disorder, Those who used substances had an odds ratio of 6.4 for committing violent crimes, whereas for those without substance use, the odds ratio was only 1.3. Modern Amok-like events, often termed rampage shootings or mass killings, include the Columbine High School Massacre, USA, 1999, where two senior students, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, after a period of alienation, bullying, and growing violent fantasies, carried out a meticulously planned attack, murdering 12 students and one teacher and wounding 24 others before committing suicide. This event brought the concept of school shooters into global consciousness and highlighted elements consistent with the Amok phenomenon: a brooding period, intense grievance, indiscriminate violence, and a suicidal end. The Virginia Tech shooting, USA, 2007 saw Seung-Hwa Cho, a student with a history of severe mental health issues and social isolation, systematically shoot and kill 32 people and wound 17 others on the university campus before taking his own life. His actions, preceded by significant psychological deterioration and expressions of rage, fit the pattern of an Amok-like rampage. In the Winnenden school shooting, Germany, 2009, Tim Kretschmer, a former student, killed 15 people in a school and on a subsequent rampage before committing suicide. This event, and others in Germany, led to intense discussions about mental health, gun control, and the Amok complex in a European context. The German government, in response to Winnenden and other incidents, significantly tightened gun laws, including mandatory psychological evaluations for those under 25 seeking firearm licenses, and increased monitoring of gun storage. As then German President Horst Kohler stated at the first anniversary of the Winnenden shooting, both houses of parliament and the governments of all German states must bring the process of toughening our gun laws forward. Much has already been done, but much more must follow, so that people capable of committing dangerous acts can threaten our schools with attacks like this one. The Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, USA, 2012 saw Adam Lanza, a severely disturbed young man, murder 20 children and 6 adult staff members at an elementary school, as well as his mother, before killing himself, exemplifying the extreme end of Amok-like violence, driven by profound mental illness and social detachment. More recently, in a stark reminder of the unpredictable nature of these events, a truck driver in the Washington, D.C. area in December 2024 led police on a wild chase in a stolen tow truck, smashing into 15 vehicles and injuring several people, including law enforcement officers. While not immediately linked to the specific psychological profile of Amok or mass shooting, this incident, much like the Berlin event in Germany, where a truck driver caused a similar incident, injuring 19, with police suspecting substance influence, highlights how severe disinhibition, potentially influenced by substance use or acute mental distress, can lead to widespread damage and endangerment, invoking the public's understanding of Amok as uncontrolled, destructive frenzy. In a separate, more directly violent incident in New Orleans around the same time, a driver intentionally slammed a truck into a crowd, killing 15 and injuring dozens, with the FBI investigating it as an act of terrorism and the perpetrator having an AR-15 style weapon. This specific New Orleans event demonstrates a clear and tragic convergence of intentional mass violence with elements reminiscent of Amok. These incidents, though diverse in their specific contexts and motivations, underscore the recurring pattern of an individual's psychological breaking point leading to a catastrophic and often self-destructive act of violence. Furthermore, despite making up less than 5% of the global population, the United States has experienced 31% of global public mass shootings between 2000 and 2022, suggesting specific national contexts like gun access significantly influence the scale of these events. Over 80% of mass shooters show signs like depression, mood swings, agitation, isolation, or trouble with daily tasks before they attack, with many even communicating violent plans ahead of time, emphasizing the importance of recognizing warning signs. Additionally, 70% of K-12 school mass shooters were known to have experienced significant childhood trauma, highlighting the deep-seated psychological distress often at play. The economic and social burden of mental ill health is substantial. For instance, people on lower incomes are up to 3 times more likely to suffer from depression, anxiety, and other common mental illnesses than those with the highest incomes, demonstrating how socioeconomic stressors exacerbate vulnerability. While the preceding discussion highlights commonalities between historical Amok and modern mass violence, it's crucial to acknowledge counterarguments and alternative interpretations to avoid oversimplification. One significant counterpoint is that Amok is primarily a distinct culture-bound syndrome, not merely a universal psychological phenomenon. Some scholars, particularly those from an older anthropological perspective, would argue that traditional Amok is so deeply embedded in specific Southeast Asian cultural contexts, complete with unique rituals, spiritual beliefs, and honor-shame dynamics, that directly comparing it to modern, Western-style mass shootings or vehicle attacks is an oversimplification. They would say that while the behavior of sudden violence might appear similar, the meaning and underlying cultural drivers are fundamentally different, making the comparison misleading. They might point to the historical concept of hantu belian, an evil tiger spirit in Malay folklore, as an example of a culturally specific explanation that doesn't translate to a US school shooter. However, the article responds by acknowledging the unique cultural origins and nuances of traditional Amok, but emphasizes its aim to identify shared psychological and behavioral patterns that can transcend specific cultural contexts. The shift in psychiatric understanding from culture-bound syndromes to cultural concepts of distress highlights that while the expression of distress is culturally shaped, the underlying human psychological vulnerabilities, for example, severe grievance, humiliation, desperation, dissociation, can be universal. Even if the specific honor-shame dynamic of traditional Malay Amok isn't present, modern perpetrators of mass violence often experience intense perceived humiliation, injustice, and social alienation that drive their rage, a functional equivalent of the loss of face that historically preceded Amok. The article is not claiming modern events are traditional Amok, but that they share a frenzied state of violence as a common thread. The focus is on understanding the mechanism of psychological breakdown and violent outburst, rather than claiming identical cultural etiology. The shared elements of brooding, a sudden violent eruption, and often self-destructive ends suggest a deeper, cross-cultural psychological phenomenon at play, even if the cultural wrapper differs. Another counter-argument addresses the potential overemphasis on mental illness as a primary cause of violence. A significant criticism, especially from mental health advocates, would be that the article, despite its caveats, could still implicitly link Amok-like violence too strongly to mental illness. They would argue that this risks stigmatizing individuals with mental health conditions, most of whom are not violent and are, in fact, more likely to be victims of violence. They would assert that focusing on mental illness deflects attention from other crucial factors like easy access to firearms, socioeconomic disparities, and societal failures. The article directly addresses this by explicitly stating and reiterating that the vast majority of individuals with mental illness are not violent and that only 3% to 5% of violent acts can be attributed solely to persons with severe mental illness. This crucial point is made to directly counter the stigmatizing misconception. The article explores mental health conditions, like psychotic or severe mood disorders, as potential contributors to the psychopathological behavior that can manifest as an Amok-like state, but it clearly presents a multi-causal model, incorporating psychological, sociocultural, and biological factors. It explicitly highlights that substance abuse often doubles the risk of violence for individuals with mental illness, and that significant childhood trauma is prevalent among mass shooters. Crucially, the article also dedicates significant attention to the role of gun availability, particularly in the U.S. context. It cites data showing that the U.S., despite its population size, experiences a disproportionate share of global mass shootings, suggesting that the means of violence, firearms, amplifies the lethality of Amok-like acts, regardless of the perpetrator's mental state. This comprehensive approach ensures that mental illness is discussed as one factor among many, not the sole or primary determinant of such complex violence. As Dr. Jeffrey Swanson, a professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Duke University, consistently argues, serious mental illness, by itself, is not a very good predictor of violence. He contends that focusing solely on mental illness distracts from other crucial risk factors and solutions, stating, "When the public hears that mass violence is all about mental illness, it stigmatizes people with mental illness and it doesn't help prevent mass violence." Furthermore, some argue that the Amok label might be too broad, risking dilution of specificity. Critics might contend that using the term Amok-like to describe phenomena as varied as school shootings, politically motivated attacks, and vehicle rampages, like the Washington, D.C. or Berlin incidents, is overly broad. They would argue that it lumps together fundamentally different events with distinct motivations, levels of premeditation, and social contexts, thereby sacrificing precision and hindering the development of targeted prevention strategies. An ideological terrorist attack, they might assert, is profoundly different from a spontaneous outburst of rage, even if both involve mass casualties. In response, the article uses Amok-like as a descriptive term to highlight behavioral commonalities and a shared psychological trajectory, for example, a period of brooding, intense grievance, a sudden escalation into violence, often with a self-destructive element, that can be observed across various forms of mass violence. It explicitly differentiates between the traditional cultural syndrome of Amok and modern interpretations where the term is used to describe sudden, frenzied, and dangerous behavior. The article avoids claiming that all these incidents are identical. Instead, it uses the Amok-like framework as a lens to explore shared elements of disinhibition, rage, and a breakdown of control, while simultaneously detailing the unique aspects and diverse triggers of modern events. For instance, it notes the investigation into the New Orleans truck incident as potentially terrorism, distinguishing it from the Berlin event which might be due to substance influence. The discussion of premeditation versus spontaneity within the Amok-like framework acknowledges that not all modern incidents perfectly mirror traditional Amok's suddenness. By exploring these commonalities, the article aims to foster a broader understanding of the psychological states that can lead to such devastation, without suggesting that all mass violence fits a single, rigid definition. It encourages a multifaceted approach to prevention that addresses both universal psychological vulnerabilities and specific contextual factors. Lastly, concerns arise that biological explanations, while important, can be reductionist and underemphasize social factors. While neurological and neurotransmitter discussions provide valuable insight, an overemphasis on biological predispositions risks overlooking the profound impact of social determinants of health inequality, and cultural messaging on violent behavior. Even if a biological vulnerability exists, it's often the interaction with severe social stressors, poverty, abuse, discrimination, that triggers violent behavior. Focusing too much on brain dysfunction can inadvertently shift blame away from societal failures or policy choices. While Dr. Sapolsky discusses biology, he strongly emphasizes the immense role of environment and social context in shaping behavior. A sociologist like Dr. Patrick Sharkey, who studies urban violence, would stress that the fundamental causes of violence are social and economic. When you have institutions that are not functioning, you get violence. These counterarguments do not negate the shared psychological underpinnings of distress and aggression but encourage a more nuanced and context-sensitive approach to understanding violent phenomena, recognizing the distinct cultural, social, and policy landscapes in which they occur. The issue of Amok and its modern manifestations has profound short and long-term implications for individuals, communities, and society at large, spanning psychological, social, economic, and policy domains. The most direct and devastating short-term consequence is the immediate loss of life and injury. In traditional Amok, this was often a limited number of individuals in a confined area, but in modern mass violence, the scale can be much larger due to high-powered weapons. As the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SVSA, notes regarding mass violence incidents, these violent acts typically target defenseless citizens with the intent to harm or kill. They can instill feelings of confusion, fear, and helplessness in survivors. Survivors, witnesses, first responders, and even those indirectly exposed through media, experience immediate and intense psychological distress. This can manifest as shock, overwhelming anxiety, terror, grief, guilt, and acute stress reactions. These initial reactions, if unaddressed, can lay the groundwork for more chronic conditions. The psychological impact of intentionally caused disasters, such as terrorist attacks, tends to be more severe than that of natural disasters, states a ResearchGate study on the psychological impact of Amok attacks, indicating the unique distress caused by human-perpetrated violence, which often involves a profound violation of safety and trust. Schools, workplaces, and public spaces where such events occur are immediately disrupted. There's a pervasive sense of fear, loss of safety, and a breakdown of trust within the affected community. Daily routines are halted, and a period of mourning and recovery begins. The ripple effect extends to local businesses, public services, and infrastructure, which may face closures, increased security demands, and logistical challenges. The immediate aftermath of events like the Sandy Hook or Virginia Tech shootings saw entire communities grappling with profound grief, fear, and a temporary halt to normal life, with schools becoming sites of remembrance rather than learning, and public gatherings marked by a somber vigilance. Significant resources are immediately diverted for emergency services, police, paramedics, hospitals, investigations, and securing the area. This can strain local resources and require multi-agency coordination, often involving state and federal assets. The initial hours are critical for containing the threat, treating the wounded, and preserving evidence, making efficient and well-practiced response protocols paramount. Such events immediately dominate news cycles, leading to intense public discussions about their causes, perpetrator motivations, and potential solutions. This can be a period of both crucial information dissemination and, unfortunately, widespread misinformation or sensationalism, which can further traumatize affected communities and potentially inspire copycat attacks. In the long term, many individuals directly or indirectly affected can develop chronic mental health issues, including post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, depression, anxiety disorders, and substance use disorders. This can persist for years, affecting quality of life, relationships, and daily functioning. Children and adolescents are particularly vulnerable to long-term psychological impacts, potentially affecting their development and academic performance. Trauma can have long-lasting effects on both mental and physical health, shaping how individuals think, feel and respond to the world around them, notes Change Mental Health. Furthermore, research shows that gunshot survivors experience a 51% increase in psychiatric disorders and an 85% increase in substance use disorders, according to Gifford's Law Center, indicating the severe and specific burden on those directly injured. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, a leading expert on trauma, in The Body Keeps the Score, would emphasize how unaddressed trauma literally rewires the brain, impacting emotional regulation, memory, and the capacity for connection, leading to long-term suffering for survivors and witnesses. He would also highlight the importance of somatic therapies and community-based interventions in healing. The economic costs are substantial and long-lasting, far exceeding initial emergency response. They include medical expenses for physical and mental health treatment, often borne by public health systems or insurance companies, potentially leading to increased premiums, lost productivity due to injury or psychological impact, absenteeism, reduced work capacity, increased security measures, security guards, surveillance, hardened infrastructure, decreased property values in affected areas, and reduced business growth or tourism. The cost of legal processes, victim compensation, and long-term rehabilitation further adds to the financial toll. The Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Congress reports that gun violence injuries cost victims and their families more than $1 billion each year in initial direct medical costs alone, and increased school security measures in response to gun violence cost more than $3 billion each year. The Urban Institute also found that gun violence reduced local business growth by 4%, illustrating the broader ripple effect on local economies. Mass violence incidents often ignite fierce, prolonged debates over root causes, for example, mental illness, gun control, social inequality, radicalization, and policy responses. This can lead to political polarization and a struggle to implement effective, consensual solutions, often delaying critical interventions. The emotional intensity of these debates can make rational policymaking extremely challenging. The ongoing debate around gun control in the U.S. following mass shootings is a prime example of this protracted societal struggle, where different interpretations of the problem lead to stalemates in policy, with each major incident reigniting the same arguments. A long-term consequence can be an erosion of public trust in safety, government, and even fellow citizens. There may be increased vigilance, avoidance of public spaces, and a general shift in social behavior driven by fear. This can manifest as reduced participation in community events, increased social isolation, and a more guarded approach to interpersonal interactions. Sociologist Robert Putnam's work on social capital would suggest that such events erode the bonds of trust and reciprocity within communities, leading to more fragmented and fearful societies over time, making collective action and civic engagement more difficult. Despite experts clarifying that most individuals with mental illness are not violent, high-profile Amok-like incidents can unfortunately reinforce stigma against those with mental health conditions. This can deter individuals from seeking help, leading to untreated illness and further suffering, creating a vicious cycle where fear perpetuates silence and isolation. As the National Council on Aging explains, mental health stigma can lead to people with mental illness being discriminated against and bullied, feeling isolated and excluded, experiencing low self-esteem, and even having suicidal thoughts. They also note, by some estimates, as many as 83% of those who could benefit from treatment don't seek it out, showcasing the dire consequences of stigma. In the long term, such events can lead to significant legal, policy, and institutional reforms related to mental health care access, threat assessment, security protocols, and, controversially, gun control legislation. These reforms are often incremental and can be shaped by public pressure and political will. Many countries, including Germany, post-Winnenden, and the U.S., have seen calls for, and sometimes enactment of, red flag laws, expanded background checks, and increased mental health screenings in response to mass violence. These reforms aim to improve early detection and prevention. For communities repeatedly affected by such violence, Trauma can become intergenerational, impacting children and future generations who may internalize fear and grievance, even if they didn't directly experience the event. This can manifest as heightened anxiety, difficulty forming secure attachments, and a diminished sense of safety in the world, perpetuating cycles of psychological distress. A European Commission report on mass violence notes, historical collective trauma can be transmitted over generations, causing trauma and grievances in children who have not experienced the event itself. This underscores the long shadow cast by such events. Addressing the risk of Amok, in both its traditional and modern manifestations, requires a multifaceted approach focusing on prevention, early intervention, and effective crisis management. Prevention strategies often include increased access to mental health care, early identification of individuals at risk, and appropriate treatment for underlying psychological disorders, promoting mental health literacy to reduce stigma and encourage help seeking. As Dr. Thomas Insel, former director of the National Institute of Mental Health, emphasized, we have effective treatments for mental disorders. The challenge is getting them to the people who need them. Developing systems to identify and evaluate individuals who pose a potential threat of violence through behavioral analysis, communication of concerns by peers or family, and professional risk assessment requires training in various settings, schools, workplaces, communities, to recognize warning signs like social withdrawal, expressions of severe grievance, fascination with violence, or concerning changes in behavior. Establishing clear protocols for schools, workplaces, and public spaces to respond effectively to acts of violence, including lockdown procedures, evacuation instructions, and rapid communication systems with law enforcement, alongside regular drills and exercises, is crucial for preparedness. Fostering environments that reduce social isolation, bullying, and feelings of marginalization, and teaching conflict resolution skills, empathy and anger management, can help individuals manage grievances constructively. Responsible gun control measures also play a critical role in mitigating risk, although this remains a deeply debated topic, especially in the United States. While German gun laws are notably stricter, adhering to the European Union (EU) Firearms Directive (EU 2021-555), and including mandatory psychological evaluations for those under 25, the U.S. faces a more complex landscape. Recent legislative changes in the U.S. in 2024 to 2025 demonstrate this ongoing polarization. While states like California and New York have strengthened limitations on handgun purchases and implemented consumer warnings, other states like South Carolina and Louisiana have moved to legalize open carry without a permit. Federally, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act of 2022 represented the first significant gun reform in decades, expanding background checks and restricting gun ownership for certain individuals, but it fell short of more comprehensive measures sought by gun control advocates. Critically, research published in the BMJ in 2019 found that states with more permissive gun laws and greater gun ownership had higher rates of mass shootings, and a growing divide appears to be emerging between restrictive and permissive states. As former President Barack Obama powerfully articulated in 2016, we are the only advanced country on Earth that sees this kind of mass violence erupt with this kind of frequency. It doesn't happen in other advanced countries. It's not even close. This suggests that while mental health is a factor, the availability of firearms plays a significant role in the scale of violence. Finally, encouraging responsible reporting of violent events to avoid sensationalism and the glorification of perpetrators, focusing instead on the victims and the impact of violence, can help prevent copycat phenomena. Treatment for individuals who have experienced or are at risk of Amok involves psychotherapy to address underlying psychological issues, develop coping mechanisms for anger, stress, and trauma, and improve emotional regulation. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, and psychodynamic approaches can be particularly useful. Pharmacotherapy, medication, prescribed and monitored by a psychiatrist, can manage symptoms of psychotic disorders, severe mood disorders, or underlying anxiety. Supportive therapies and rehabilitation help individuals reintegrate into society, build healthy relationships, and develop vocational skills, with family therapy often addressing dysfunctional dynamics and building a supportive environment. Long-term follow-up and relapse prevention strategies are crucial. In cases where violence has occurred, a thorough forensic psychiatric evaluation is essential to understand the individual's mental state at the time of the act, inform legal proceedings, and guide future treatment and management, focusing on both public safety and the individual's recovery. The term Amok continues to serve as a stark reminder of the destructive potential of uncontrolled rage and the critical need to understand and address the complex psychological and social factors that can lead to such tragic events. By fostering greater awareness, improving mental health resources, and implementing robust prevention strategies, societies can work towards mitigating the risk of these devastating outbursts of violence. To further clarify the point that Amok-like behavior, while culturally influenced, manifests a shared psychological core, let's look at key comparisons and contrasts. A compelling analogy for understanding both traditional Amok and modern mass violence is the pressure cooker effect. Imagine an individual's psychological state as a pressure cooker. This represents the individual's internal world, where intense distress, feelings of humiliation, perceived injustices, or profound alienation are building up. The heat comes from stressors like bullying, social isolation, trauma, or mental health struggles. The lid is the individual's inability to cope, communicate, or find healthy outlets for these overwhelming emotions. Over time, the pressure inside the cooker intensifies, becoming unbearable. There are often subtle, or sometimes overt, hissing sounds, warning signs like withdrawal, brooding, violent fantasies, or expressions of grievance, indicating the dangerous buildup. These signs might be missed or misinterpreted by those around the individual. Eventually, the pressure cooker can no longer contain the internal forces. It either explodes violently, like a dam breaking under immense strain, or the safety valve fails, leading to a sudden, frenzied, and often indiscriminate outburst. This is the Amok moment, a catastrophic, uncontained release of accumulated psychological pressure, often leaving a trail of destruction and confusion. In the modern context, certain factors act as powerful amplifiers or force multipliers. Think of these as adding extra fuel to the fire or making the explosion far more devastating than it might otherwise be. Easy access to high-capacity firearms is the most significant amplifier, transforming a potentially contained act of violence, like a knife attack, into a mass casualty event with widespread fatalities and injuries. Other amplifiers can include online radicalization and extremist ideologies that provide a warped justification for violence, media sensationalism that inadvertently provides a script or a path to notoriety, or lack of robust community support systems and mental health infrastructure that could have diffused the pressure earlier. This analogy helps to illustrate the shared underlying process where the internal buildup of unbearable pressure is common to both traditional Amok and many modern mass violence incidents. It speaks to a fundamental human breaking point under extreme stress. It highlights the catastrophic release as the outcome when this pressure reaches its breaking point, indicating a critical failure of internal and external coping mechanisms. Finally, it emphasizes the role of external factors, where while the internal mechanism is similar, modern tools, amplifiers, dramatically increase the scale of the devastation, transforming individual acts of despair into public catastrophes with widespread impact. The primary argument for connecting traditional Amok with modern mass violence lies in the shared underlying psychological trajectory and behavioral patterns, regardless of the specific cultural or technological context. Both involve a buildup of internalized distress, where in traditional Amok, this was often preceded by prolonged brooding over perceived humiliation, loss of face, or injustice, with distress internalized due to rigid social norms. Similarly, modern mass violence perpetrators frequently exhibit escalating social isolation, grievance collection, and a profound sense of being wronged, often fueled by online echo chambers or personal failures. Both illustrate a pressure cooker effect where psychological tension builds to an unbearable level without intervention or healthy coping mechanisms. The specific reason for the shame or grievance differs. For example, social status in traditional Amok versus bullying/ideology in modern cases, but the experience of overwhelming, internalized distress leading to a breaking point is strikingly similar, a fundamental human response to prolonged, unaddressed suffering. Another shared characteristic is the sudden, explosive, and indiscriminate or targeted violence. Traditional Amok was characterized by a sudden, frenzied, and often indiscriminate attack, where the perpetrator might target anyone in their path as if in an altered state of consciousness. Modern mass violence, while sometimes meticulously planned, often involves a rapid, intense burst of violence that can feel frenzied, even if targets were pre-selected, with lethality significantly amplified by modern weaponry. The transition from internal distress to external, violent rampage is a key shared feature, where the loss of inhibitory control, the overwhelming surge of aggression, and the sheer destructive energy unleashed are functionally comparable. Whether the violence is truly indiscriminate or strategically targeted, the intense, explosive nature of the outbursts remains a common thread, reflecting a severe breakdown in behavioral control. A significant self-destructive element is also often present, with both traditional Amok and modern mass violence frequently ending in the perpetrator's death. Traditional Amok frequently ended with the perpetrator being killed by others, effectively suicide by cop, or by their own hand after the rampage, often understood as a final, desperate act to escape unbearable reality or restore honor. A significant proportion of modern mass shooters and perpetrators of other Amok-like acts die by suicide at the scene or are killed by law enforcement, suggesting profound despair and a lack of intent for long-term survival, indicating that the act itself is often a form of extended suicide, a final, violent self-immolation. This suicidal ideation or death wish during the act highlights a shared element of profound hopelessness and a desire for a dramatic exit from an intolerable existence, reinforcing the idea that these are often acts of despair as much as aggression, a desperate cry for release that takes a horrific form. Furthermore, dissociation or amnesia is commonly observed. In traditional Amok, post-event amnesia or a profound dissociative state during the act was a classic symptom, with perpetrators reporting no memory or a dreamlike, derealized state. While not universally reported, some perpetrators of modern mass violence describe feeling detached, numb, or experiencing a sense of unreality during their rampage, consistent with dissociative states. This detachment can allow individuals to perform horrific acts without feeling the full emotional impact or moral weight in the moment. This altered state of consciousness, whether full amnesia or partial dissociation, suggests a shared psychological mechanism where the mind detaches from the horrific reality of the actions, potentially to allow the act to occur, to cope with immense internal conflict, or as a symptom of severe underlying mental health conditions. While similarities exist, important contrasts highlight how cultural and societal contexts shape the expression and impact of these phenomena. The motivation and cultural script differ significantly. Traditional Amok was often driven by specific cultural concepts of honor, shame, and restoration of dignity within a collectivist framework, a desperate response to irreparable loss of face with a clear understanding by the community of the precise trigger. The act, while horrific, sometimes fit within a distorted cultural narrative. Modern mass violence motivations are far more diverse and highly individualized, including social alienation, severe bullying, political or ideological extremism, for example, white supremacy, incel ideology, acute mental health crises, such as untreated psychosis or severe depression, desire for notoriety or fame, and a broader, generalized sense of grievance against society or specific groups. The cultural script is less defined and more fragmented, often influenced by online communities, violent media, or individual manifestos. The specific cultural lens through which humiliation is experienced, and the prescribed solution, even a violent one, differs profoundly. Traditional Amok had a more culturally legible narrative, whereas modern mass violence can feel more fragmented, unpredictable, and driven by an array of individual and globalized influences. The means and scale of violence also present a crucial contrast. Traditional Amok typically involved readily available traditional bladed weapons like swords, for example, kris, or knives, with immediate casualties often limited by the weapon's nature. The damage was often localized and personal. Modern mass violence predominantly involves firearms, particularly high-capacity semi-automatic weapons, or vehicles used as weapons, dramatically increasing the lethality and scale of casualties and allowing a single individual to inflict widespread harm rapidly. This is a crucial distinction. While the underlying psychological state might be similar, the technology available in modern societies allows for far greater and more indiscriminate destruction, transforming a localized frenzy into a large-scale public tragedy. This is particularly evident when comparing the USA's higher rates of mass shootings to European nations like Germany with stricter gun laws, where perpetrators, when they exist, often resort to less lethal means or are apprehended before mass casualties. Finally, the societal response and interpretation differ profoundly. Traditional Amok was often understood within local cultural frameworks, sometimes with spiritual or supernatural explanations, or seen as a tragic but understandable outcome of immense shame. The community response might have involved immediate restraint or killing of the perpetrator, followed by communal healing rituals or social realignment. Modern mass violence triggers intense public and political debates, often polarized along lines of mental health versus gun control, or terrorism versus individual pathology. The response involves extensive law enforcement and psychological interventions, but also protracted societal arguments over prevention strategies, security measures, and the role of the media. There's less communal understanding and more collective shock, fear, and a demand for concrete policy solutions, often leading to deep societal divisions and a sense of collective vulnerability. The cultural framework for making sense of the violence, and the prescribed societal responses, differ profoundly. Western societies tend to medicalize and politicize these events, seeking diagnostic labels and legislative solutions, whereas traditional societies might spiritualize or integrate them within existing social mechanisms, sometimes with a fatalistic acceptance. This difference in interpretation heavily influences the public discourse and the effectiveness of prevention efforts. By drawing these comparisons and contrasts, we can better understand that while the term Amok provides a valuable historical and psychological lens, it's not a perfect overlay for all modern extreme violence. Instead, it highlights how similar human vulnerabilities, when combined with distinct cultural pressures and modern technological means, can lead to devastating, albeit uniquely expressed, outcomes.